Right now we are at the CORESTART 2.0 conference, and it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Warren, a very well-known open source contributor. So Matt, it's nice to see you here.
Oh, thanks.
I really appreciate that you have come here to Prague. So can you tell us something about what you are doing and who you are?
Yeah, so as you said, my name is Matt Warren. I do some open source contributions, mostly in a project called BenchmarkDotNet. I don't do that as much recently, but I did that quite a bit for a few years. And a while back I was involved in something called RavenDB, another .NET project. I did some contributions there, so just various bits. But the last year or so, I've been trying to contribute to some of the Microsoft .NET repositories on GitHub, so things like the core CLR a little bit, and I do some contributions, but I also spend quite a lot of time trying to figure out some of the internals. That's probably my main bit, and if anyone has read my blog, that's probably some of the stuff they've read on there, where because it's now all open source, we can really look at the internals of the CLR, particularly the runtime and what's going on down at the really lowest level. And I just happen to really like doing that sort of stuff, so I'm more than happy to wade through the code and figure some stuff out. And because it's really useful actually, because it has been open source now for I guess 3 years or so. You could probably have done some of the stuff I write about before with WinDBG and sort of low-level debugging, but that requires a whole lot of knowledge that's probably beyond me. But now it's all there as source. You can take the source, you can look at the source up on GitHub, you can run it locally, you can compile it, you can make changes, you can put in printf stuff, you can do whatever you want and run stuff. So it's really a nice way of being able to figure out what the CLR is doing. So that's probably the main bit I do, sort of internals, low-level stuff. Not quite at the level of assembly, I don't really know much assembly, but certainly some of the stuff that goes on in .NET below the C# code, you know, the C++ code that's going on down there.
So basically MS Core lib, maybe?
Yeah, MS Core
on
lib.
this level?
Yeah, that kind of level. That's the bit I tend, I mean, I've done a bit in CoreFX to sort of higher, but yeah, I tend to find I gravitate towards that area, and sometimes stuff around the GC, that's in there as well. The JIT is another component, that's a bit of a black box to me, I'm trying to learn more about that, but yeah, the GC, the core of the runtime, that sort of stuff, and I tend to just basically see something that I don't understand, figure it out, write a blog post, and it seems that a lot of other people seem to like that as well, which is quite good, and I think that hopefully that helps other people. I think one of the bits I talked about in my talk is that actually now it's open source, part of the stuff you can contribute is helping people understand it. So some people can send lots of pull requests and fix loads of features and implement things like that, and I do a bit of that, but I think also it's quite good to be able to shine a light on the internals of the CLR, and it doesn't necessarily help everyone every day in their job, but I think sometimes some of this stuff helps. You know, I've written posts on the internals of delegates, or how bits of the GC work under the hood, or what's going on when an exception's thrown and it builds a stack trace, those sorts of things. You know, they're not stuff that comes up every day, but they are stuff that we're using at some point in our jobs, and I think people seem to like understanding what's going on there, so that works for me.
You are also Microsoft MVP. For how long?
Just been made one back in June, I think, this year, so not even a year yet, so I'm quite new to it.
Yeah, you're fresh.
Yeah, fresh-faced MVP, yeah.
And do you speak at some community events in Britain? Yeah.
So in the UK, we're really fortunate. There's a real good set of community-run events under they're known as the DDD, or developer events, and they've been going for quite a few years. Some are in Microsoft offices, some are just other places, but they are independent from Microsoft. Microsoft provides the hosting and stuff, but it's community run, community speakers, and we get a real good mix of speakers for that. People who speak at huge paid conferences often do talks at those as well, and they're free days. You get a free lunch, so it's a good day out as well, I suppose. But I do that, and occasionally I speak at there's a London .NET user group. So when I can, and when I have something hopefully interesting to do into a talk, I sort of occasionally write blog posts that I think might be talks, or some of my blog posts turn into talks. It's a bit of a mix, but yeah, when I can, I like to do this speaking. Yeah, it's good fun.
And do you plan to speak at some bigger conferences, like NDC or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I try and submit. I see what happens. Yeah, I know a lot of them are very popular, and they get lots of submissions, and sometimes maybe the stuff I talk about is not a good fit for a general I don't know, but yeah, I do enjoy it. I think I've been to a lot of conferences now, and people seem to appreciate some of the low-level stuff. People are quite happy, as long as it's relatively well explained, people are quite happy listening to about low-level internals as well, and performance and stuff like that. So it seems to be quite well received, and yeah.
You were mentioning BenchmarkDotNet. Is there any particular area of this project? Because it's been used widely on many products, and I think that a lot of applications which Microsoft produces really owes to the BenchmarkDotNet, because it allowed them to optimize and get the relevant data. So are you working on some particular area of BenchmarkDotNet, or you're just...
I've been a bit slack. I don't manage to find the time to do blogging and open source at the same time, and I've done the blogging stuff for a little while. But when I was there before, so to just take a step back, if people don't know BenchmarkDotNet, the idea, there's a guy called Andre who's the owner of the project. I'm not going to take credit for that, but I got involved with him early on, and we sort of we realised that in .NET there wasn't a commonly used benchmarking library, and in the Java world, basically if you write any benchmarks and they're not written in something called JMH, which is the Java micro benchmark harness, people just discard the results. They say, go away and write it. So the idea, we were not saying that BenchmarkDotNet had to be the only one, but we wanted there to be at least one where you could trust the results, because a lot of the time when people write a benchmark, there's a few things you can get wrong. I'm not saying it's rocket science, but there's a few bits you can get wrong. And so a lot of the time people publish benchmarks on something, half the discussion is trying to work out if the benchmark is accurate or not. And so our real reason for doing BenchmarkDotNet was to first and foremost provide an accurate way that you can put your benchmark attribute on the method, and we take care of the rest. We do the job of benchmarking it, giving you mathematically valuable results, giving you nice display and other stuff. And so I was involved in some of the core bits, but the main bit I did when I was back working on it was starting off some of the extra information we give you. So one thing we give you is the timings, and we make sure that they're accurate. That's the core bit. If we don't even get the timings right, then we may as well not bother. A benchmarking library needs to give accurate results. But on top of that, and one of the most popular bits that I had the initial versions of, although it's changed now, was showing you the number of allocations. You run method A and method B. Method B might be faster, but method A doesn't allocate, so it's a trade-off. Or method B is faster because it allocates. It doesn't allocate an error. So we tried to give you that. So one of the bits of information you get in BenchmarkDotNet, if you enable it, is that how much your method allocates every time it's called. And because allocations in .NET have a kind of knock-on effect that at some point the garbage collector is going to need to kick in and clean up those allocations. It's not for free. There's some overheads there of using it. So it's just a bit of extra information to know. So I kind of got involved in most of the diagnostic side of BenchmarkDotNet, the extra information. And that's now grown. We can give you, BenchmarkDotNet will give you the assembly code. It will give you whether methods were inlined or not inlined. It's just trying to give you, so it's not the same as a fully featured profiler, but when you run your benchmarks, we try and give you extra information to explain why this method is faster than this method, and often that comes down to allocations, a generated code, those sorts of things. So yeah, I guess the diagnostic side is probably the bit I've been most involved with BenchmarkDotNet,
And I have been playing with BenchmarkDotNet in several of my projects. It's for the beginner, it's very easy to use, because there's something you have to plug in your own code, and it does you all the benchmarks. I was quite surprised about the differences between server GC and the client one, which is used on client versions of Windows. Did you work with the? Do you know about some differences between those? What are the key differences between server and client GC?
And Workstation, So a lot of it comes down to multi-threaded or multi-core. The Workstation GC has been there since the beginning, and it's basically designed for when we run on one CPU. And it's designed for desktop applications that tend to run on one thread maybe, so having lots of threads isn't necessarily a benefit, because the application is not multi-threaded. Server is for the world of where we have multi-threads in the program, so having multiple threads, one thread per core, the GC will allocate one thread per core of your processor to do GC, and it means that it can split up the workload. It can be doing GC on one thread while another core is free, that sort of stuff, so it can balance stuff. So that's probably where the main, they're different design philosophies. The Workstation is meant a bit more for absolute low latency, but maybe the throughput is different, because on a desktop app, what you don't necessarily want is when you click a button to be a big pause because the GC kicks in. I mean, you don't necessarily want that in a server, but it's spread out across multiple threads, so it's less of a problem. If your one GC thread blocks for too long, so there's a bit of a trade-off there in terms of what it does. And also the server one allocates more memory because it's designed for a time when we had more memory and stuff like that. So there's various trade-offs. So yeah, one of the options quite often to fix GC issues, if you've diagnosed what the problem is to enable server GC, and that's quite often enabled out by default in things like ASP.NET. So generally it's the one you're using, but yeah, but there can be scenarios depending on your application where Workstation is faster. There's a lot of variations. It's with most stuff to do with the GC, the answer is it depends. There's a lot of stuff, but that's the general. And I think it might come. I can't remember exactly all the different modes, but there may be scenarios where Workstation doesn't run in 64-bit and stuff like that, or it doesn't take as much. It doesn't take as much memory. It was designed for a time when it was more constrained devices. So.
I've been experiencing in some web applications when I was running it in a desktop on my dev station, the GC behaved very differently in comparison of how did it behave on the server, and I think that on the Workstation GC maybe releases the memory much more frequently than the server, which tries to still not run GC until the last moment when it really needs to do it.
Yeah, so. And I think as well the server by default allocates bigger heaps, so it's got more memory to use up before it needs to worry about it running out. And it also allocates per thread. So certainly the overall the memory usage just from the GC will be higher in server than Workstation. That's true.
You also mentioned RavenDB. Have you been using it in some bigger projects?
No, I never managed to use it at work, unfortunately. Yeah, it's a nice project because if people don't know, it's a NoSQL store for .NET, and so it's not the same as a classical database, but it has many of the issues of a database. So it's interesting. I haven't been involved for a couple of years, but when I was involved, trying to see the stuff they're trying to do. So trying to make .NET, you've got to be very careful about the way you control memory in a database server. You've got to be careful about the GC. You've got to understand low-level things. You don't want to be copying data around all the time. There's a lot of unsafe code in there. There's a lot of optimization. So it's a real interesting example of showing actually you can do that low-level stuff in .NET. It's not. A lot of the code you're writing is not your standard .NET code, and it's not recommended unless you really need performance, but it does show that .NET is quite flexible, that you can, with time and effort and a bit of knowledge and stuff, you can write pretty low-level stuff in .NET, and some of the stuff they do in the low levels of that, they've implemented the entire database engine in C#, so it's impressive. But yeah, it's a nice project. There's some nice stuff in there. There's database storage, it uses Lucene for indexing and stuff, so it's but yeah, no, unfortunately I could never quite, I did some proof of concepts on a couple of things, but we never managed to get a project out with it for, not because of RavenDB, but because of other reasons. So yeah, unfortunately not, but I had fun working on it.
So we just finished the session at CoreStart. What was your session about?
So it was titled Microsoft and Open Source, A Brave New World, and I was trying to look at, or trying to show that there's been a real big change in Microsoft with regards to open source over the last few years. They have been open sourcing stuff for a while, but 3 years ago, almost to the day actually, there was the big announcement around open sourcing in effect the whole of the .NET framework, the core CLR, the core framework library, the runtime, the compiler had been open source for a little while, but it was included, the tooling, the decisions they're making, everything is now out in the open, all up on GitHub, github.com/.net, and also under /Microsoft. There's a couple of main organisations that do it. So Microsoft they're now one of the biggest organisations present on GitHub. GitHub's produced some yearly stats showing that, so it's a real big change. I guess I like to think of it that now, I don't know for sure, even as an MVP I don't know exactly the internals, but I think that it's now about why shouldn't we open source something rather than why should we. It's kind of flipped that. And I think particularly opening sourcing the whole of the .NET runtime and sometimes it's talked about of source open rather than open source. I think it clearly is open source in that it's not just they've thrown the code up there and said go and have a look at it, go and do what you want. They've their engineers are working out in the open source. They're engaging the community. They are accepting pull requests for quite large features. They're trying to, I think, work honestly. I'm not claiming it's all being good, and there's obviously stuff that along the way that's been some issues or people have had problems because we're seeing everything out in the open versus in .NET. Over the years, we basically stuff's arrived at a conference has been announced. Here's a big new feature in .NET or in Visual Studio or whatever. Now we're seeing the process along the way. So there's obviously a bit of bumpiness there, but it's trying to show to people, because we're all .NET at the conference. We're all .NET developers, and we all work on the code that runs on the runtime. We might not all care about it to the lower levels. That's fine. Different people have different interests, but it is now all open source. Certainly, if we're using .NET Core, so we can go and look at stuff. We can, we can contribute. We can suggest features. We can, if we want to, we could go and fix a bug, or at the very least, file an issue and see if the bug gets fixed. But we can have a part in that and trying to explain to people where they can get involved, what the different repos are up there, ones that are more well-known, less well-known. There's a whole variety of repos depending on your interest of the .NET stack, what the process is. So it's kind of an overall look at what's available, what Microsoft have been doing, and trying to also answer the question of actually, since it's happened, a big announcement, I guess, 3 years ago, does the community care? Has the community been contributing? So there's a sort of a mix of things.
I think that there was a very large community involvement, and it took some time for Microsoft to learn how to work with the community, but now I think they are very transparent in all the technological decisions. Even I'm watching quite intensively the Roslyn team, and about new language features in C# is really amazing, because you can discuss with real people on GitHub what you think, what you like, what you don't like, and of course there is some decisions made right in the Microsoft without the community, but they're trying very intensively to share as much as they can, and I think it's really amazing for me. Maybe do you see some disadvantages of open sourcing .NET?
In my talk, I do a bit of a good, bad, and ugly section, and there's clearly been some bumps along the way. Part of it, I describe it as like we're now seeing how the sausage is being made. So rather than getting the nice end product all wrapped up nicely, we're seeing what goes into the process. So I guess that is one of the disadvantages. They're doing this stuff out in the open, which means that us as a community outside of Microsoft are seeing every step along the way. Sometimes there's problems with communication, sometimes there's decisions we don't like, all those sorts of stuff. And then it turned into Twitter, people tweeting about it, blog posts, all that sort of stuff. So I guess that's possibly one of the disadvantages. But I think that's settled down. There's always going to be. Now we've got to the point of .NET Standard 2.0 and stuff. Things are a bit more firm. There's now commitment to that as a standard. The tooling has become more mature. There's stuff that's not going to be the churn. So I think for people joining in now, I don't want to give a bad impression. It has been probably a bumpy road. There's been stuff along the way, but the state of things now is good. So, I guess the main downside I could see from Microsoft's point of view is it's a big investment. There's engineers who seems like they spend a lot of time doing the open source stuff. Hopefully it's paying off for them in multiple ways, but there's obviously a big investment involved from Microsoft's side. It's not just publish our projects on GitHub. That's the simple bit at the beginning. It's all the other stuff that goes, the governance, the process, the involvement. If you want to do it properly, which I believe they're trying to do, they're
still learning, but I think that right now it's pretty good actually.
Yeah, it's definitely settled down, hasn't it? I think. Yeah.
Because there was a lot of confusion at the beginning. Who is contributing to which, and which team does which repository, and also even we have, as you said, we have seen the process how the new platform is being born. So there was Project JSON, then they changed it completely, and before .NET Framework they just kept these discussions and these changes inside, and then we saw only the final product. So it's right as you said. So that's great. Is there anything you are doing a part of the open source?
I'm trying to. So having spent a bit of time looking at the internals of the Coursera, I'm trying to build up to along the way you notice stuff, and sometimes I've filed issues or whatever. But I'm trying to get enough into the code. I think I understand the code from looking at it, but that's different than actually contributing. So there's a couple of things. There's a few issues that Microsoft are quite, if you put your hand up and say you'd like to contribute, they'll happily make you a contributor on some of their repos and assign issues to you. So there's a couple of ones around internals of reflection that I keep meaning to find time to do. So I'm doing that sort of stuff. I guess it's for most people it's time, day job and family and life and all that sort of stuff. And I at the moment I'm finding that actually I learn the most, and I think people respond to the blog posts. I'm not I can't hope to keep up with like a Ben Adams in terms of the level of pull requests that he manages to get through. So, but I think I've come to think as well that actually that is. Maybe it's justifying it to myself, but I think that is quite valuable. One part is great if people want to commit, pull requests and stuff like that. But there's an equal part in, documenting this stuff, explaining this sort of stuff, those things as well. I think for me at the moment, I'm tending to put most of my time and effort into those sorts of things. But there's a few bits of the internals of .NET I've got a few ideas about, but finding the time to sit down and do it is tricky. Yeah.
That's tricky. And on the CoreStart conference, I think we have more than half of the people who are seeing .NET Core, not maybe for the first time, but they haven't started working with it yet. They still have some projects on .NET Framework, and they also don't have any experience with GitHub. They can maybe download the source code from GitHub as a zip, but maybe they are not using Git, they are using some TFS or something like that. So they will have to also learn how GitHub works and how these tools works. Do you have some message for these people, or some advice, or for maybe there is somebody who wants to be involved in some open source project, how to start, what they can do?
I did a bit I tried to make the point in my talk is that we might look at people, say like a Ben Adams or someone from the community who's done lots of pull requests and think, I can't begin to get to that level. I tried to make the point is actually you can start quite simple. So on several of the .NET repositories, they have up for grabs issues as well, but they also have first timer issues, which is basically you need to be able to download the code, so you a bit of an understanding of GitHub, but there's a bunch of tutorials out there that should get you started with GitHub, and with the Visual Studio integration it's not too bad to do that. So there's first timer issues which require not much more than being able to build the code, make a few code changes to it. Some of them are even as simple as removing dead code and then check it in, and they'll code review it and stuff. So they've tried to make it really easy. So I'm trying to make the point is don't be overwhelmed. If you want to contribute to Microsoft or any stuff, don't be overwhelmed. Most people start with a really simple one. I actually showed mine and Ben's first contributions to the .NET repository, and they're both like 4 or 5 lines, a very simple change. So everyone starts somewhere. So try to not be overwhelmed. I know people might not have the time or whatever. That's a different thing. But if you got to the point where you want to contribute, don't think that this is not for me because there's too much to go on. So that would be one bit of advice. Find an up for grabs issue, find a getting started issue. It seems to be that it's very much in Microsoft's interest to make it easy for people to get to contribute, because it's one thing them doing it out in the open, but if the community doesn't respond, there's obviously some people who respond anyway, and people take the time, but if they want to grow that and they want more and more people to do it, they have been making it as easy as possible. So I think people should know that there's that sort of process. And in terms of finding your way around the source code if that's an issue as well, because they're quite large repositories. Certainly for the core CLR, there's good Microsoft docs, but for the core CLR, I wrote a blog that is the Hitchhiker's Guide to the core CLR source code, and it was exactly for this reason, that there's this big source base. Where do you even start looking? So there's resources out there, either on my blog or other places, of trying to get this sort of stuff started. So.
Okay, so thank you, Matt. It was my pleasure to talk with you. It was also the pleasure to have you on CoreStart 2.0. And I really hope that you will visit Prague next time, because next year in November we are doing a conference named, its name is Update, because the attendees will be upgrading and updating their skills and the knowledge about .NET, cloud and security. So I definitely hope that I will meet you there and you will be delivering another very interesting session. So thank you very much that you have came to us to Prague, and I hope that you'll enjoy the rest of the conference and your stay in Czech Republic.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a great time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.